A thin veil of dust hangs over the savannah as the European column advances, boots crunching in rhythm, rifles glinting under a merciless sun. Officers ride ahead on horseback, scanning the horizon with a confidence so complete it barely registers as thought. Maps are folded neatly in leather cases. Timetables are already written. In their minds, this land is vast but empty, its people numerous but untrained, its resistance assumed to be fleeting. The march feels less like a gamble than a formality, as if the outcome has already occurred somewhere else long before the first shot will ever be fired. This confidence did not emerge by accident. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, Europe had begun to see itself as the final product of human progress. Industrial foundries thundered day and night, turning coal and iron into cannons, rifles, and railways. Steamships collapsed distance. Telegraph lines bent time. Military academies refined doctrine into something approaching science. When European officers looked outward, they did so through a lens that fused technology with destiny. The assumption was simple and rarely questioned. Modern weapons would overwhelm any society that lacked them, and any resistance would dissolve the moment it encountered disciplined fire. If you stay with this story to the end, you'll see how that certainty collapsed again and again, often in ways that shocked Europe itself. And if this unfolding contradiction intrigues you, now is the moment to subscribe and like the video, not as a pause in the story, but as a promise that what seems inevitable here will soon unravel in ways most histories never linger on. In the early planning rooms of European capitals, Africa was reduced to abstractions. Lines were drawn across maps by men who had never set foot on the terrain those lines sliced through. Military briefings described tribes where there were states, chiefs where there were monarchs, and war bands where there were standing armies. Intelligence reports, when they existed at all, often filtered African societies through racial hierarchies that dismissed their political organization as primitive imitation rather than parallel development. This was not ignorance alone. It was structured belief, reinforced by decades of imperial success elsewhere. Europe's earlier encounters had encouraged this mindset. Small expeditions, coastal raids, and punitive actions had often succeeded against lightly armed opponents or fractured polities weakened by internal conflict. Each victory reinforced the lesson officers thought they had learned. Resistance was inevitable but temporary, costly but manageable. African societies were seen as reactive, never strategic, as though they were incapable of long-term planning or adaptation. The idea that an African state might deliberately study European warfare, acquire weapons, reorganize command structures, and choose the moment of confrontation was rarely entertained. Racial theory hardened these assumptions into doctrine. By the 19th century, European military writing increasingly framed combat ability as an extension of race rather than organization or leadership. Industrial power was taken as proof of innate superiority, and battlefield success was treated as a natural expression of civilization itself. In this worldview, defeat at the hands of a non-European army was not merely unlikely, it was conceptually impossible. If such a loss occurred, it could only be explained as an anomaly, a fluke, or a temporary setback caused by weather, terrain, or individual error. That belief shaped how European armies prepared for war in Africa. Campaigns were often under-resourced, rushed, or delegated to colonial forces expected to improvise on the ground. Intelligence gathering was shallow. Diplomatic signals were misread or ignored. When African rulers negotiated, Europeans frequently interpreted restraint as weakness and compromise as submission. Even warnings, from traders, missionaries, or earlier expeditions, That certain states possessed large armies or modern weapons were often discounted as exaggeration. What Europe failed to see was not hidden. African states had been observing Europe for generations. Firearms had entered African political systems long before formal colonization began, reshaping warfare and governance. Trade routes carried not only goods but information. How European units moved, how they supplied themselves, how they fought when surprised. Some African rulers sent envoys abroad, read translated manuals, and hired foreign advisors. Others relied on indigenous systems refined over centuries of regional conflict, systems that emphasized discipline, cohesion, and command in ways Europeans did not expect. Yet none of this registered within the dominant European narrative. The prevailing story cast Africa as a stage awaiting European action, not as an arena of competing powers with their own histories of victory and defeat. The imbalance was assumed to be absolute. European soldiers marched believing they were enforcers of an inevitable future, not participants in a contest whose outcome remained undecided. This assumption shaped behavior on the battlefield itself. Columns advanced deep into unfamiliar territory without adequate reconnaissance. Officers underestimated enemy numbers and overestimated the psychological impact of artillery and rifle fire. Supply lines were stretched thin under the belief that campaigns would be short. When resistance stiffened, it was often interpreted as irrational defiance rather than calculated strategy. Each misjudgment layered over the last, building toward confrontations that European commanders believed they understood, even as reality drifted further from their expectations. The tragedy and the irony is that Europe's greatest strength, its faith in its own system, became a vulnerability. Confidence dulled curiosity. Doctrine replaced observation. Assumptions hardened into blind spots. And as European forces crossed rivers, climbed escarpments, and advanced toward fortified capitals, they carried with them not just rifles and flags, but an idea so deeply ingrained that few could imagine it failing. Soon, that idea would be tested not by chaos or chance, but by African states that had prepared carefully, deliberately, and patiently. For the moment Europe believed could never come. Long before European columns began pushing inland with flags unfurled and assumptions intact, African courts were already calculating the cost of war. In palace compounds and council chambers, rulers weighed trade against sovereignty, diplomacy against force, delay against confrontation. This was not a continent waiting to react. It was one that had learned, often painfully, that survival depended on preparation, careful, methodical, and rooted in an understanding of how Europeans fought. Firearms were not strangers to Africa by the time formal colonization accelerated. Muskets, rifles, and artillery had entered African political systems through trade networks that stretched across deserts and oceans. What mattered was not simply possession, but integration. Some states stockpiled weapons as symbols of power. Others went further, reorganizing their armies around them, drilling units to fire in volleys, maintaining reserves of ammunition, and establishing command hierarchies that mirrored, sometimes surpassed, European discipline in the field. War was treated as a science, not a ritual. Preparation extended beyond weapons. African states understood terrain as an ally rather than an obstacle. Mountains, forests, rivers, and narrow passes were studied not as features on a map, but as living systems that could absorb or expose an invading force. Routes were controlled. Supply lines were targeted. European armies, accustomed to open battlefields and predictable logistics, often found themselves advancing into environments where their numerical and technological advantages were blunted by geography itself. Diplomacy was equally deliberate. African rulers negotiated with multiple European powers simultaneously, playing rivals against one another to delay annexation or secure favorable terms. Treaties were signed not out of submission, but calculation, buying time to strengthen armies, consolidate authority, and modernize administration. Some states sent envoys abroad to observe European military organization firsthand. Others invited foreign advisors selectively, extracting knowledge while limiting influence. This was adaptation without surrender. Centralization proved critical. Contrary to European caricatures, several African states maintained standing armies with clear chains of command, standardized training, and systems of mobilization capable of assembling tens of thousands of troops. Logistics were managed through taxation, tribute, and state-controlled supply networks. Food, livestock, and labor were requisitioned in advance of campaigns. Communication systems, runners, drums, horns, allowed rapid coordination across vast distances. These were not improvised reactions. They were the infrastructure of war. Equally important was political cohesion. Many African leaders recognized that internal division invited conquest. Efforts were made to suppress rival factions, integrate conquered peoples, and frame resistance as collective survival rather than personal ambition. Loyalty was reinforced through shared identity, material reward, and the clear demonstration that leadership could protect its people. Where Europe often expected fragmentation, it encountered unity forged by the threat of external domination. European observers noticed fragments of this preparation, but rarely grasped its scale. Reports describing large, disciplined African forces were often dismissed as exaggeration or misinterpretation. When intelligence contradicted expectation, expectation usually won. The belief that industrial society conferred automatic dominance proved stubbornly resistant to evidence. European commanders continued to assume that training and courage mattered less than steel and gunpowder. But preparation reshapes probability. When war finally came, it did not arrive as a sudden awakening for African states. It was the moment their planning anticipated, the test their institutions were built to face. Armies assembled with purpose. Commanders understood their objectives. The terrain was already chosen. In many cases, the outcome would hinge not on who possessed modern weapons, but on who understood war as a system, political, logistical, psychological, rather than a demonstration of force alone. This was the imbalance Europe failed to see. While European powers believed they were bringing modern war to an unprepared continent, they were often stepping into conflicts that had been studied, anticipated, and structured long before the first column crossed the border. And when the shooting started, it would become painfully clear that preparation, not presumption, decides who holds the field when the smoke finally clears. The moment of collision arrives not as chaos, but as disbelief. European columns advance expecting resistance to fracture on contact, expecting the crack of rifles to end the matter quickly. Instead, the ground ahead begins to move. Lines form where none were anticipated. Signals pass across hills and valleys with practiced speed. What was assumed to be an encounter becomes a battle, and what was planned as a demonstration of force becomes something far more dangerous, a contest whose outcome is suddenly uncertain. In southern Africa, in 1879, British forces move inland under the conviction that modern arms will compensate for distance and dispersion. They split their columns to move faster, confident that any opposition can be contained until reinforcements arrive. At Isandlwana, the British camp is left exposed, its defenses incomplete, its commanders unconvinced that a decisive engagement is imminent. Then the Zulu army appears, not as a disorderly mass, but as a coordinated force executing a plan refined through decades of regional warfare. The encirclement is swift. The firing lines are overwhelmed not by recklessness, but by disciplined movement and numbers applied at precisely the right moment. When the battle ends, more than 1,000 British and colonial troops lie dead. Rifles, ammunition, and supplies are captured. For the first time in living memory, a modern European field force has been destroyed by an African army in open battle. The shock ripples outward immediately. News travels back to London stripped of disbelief, but heavy with consequence. Explanations are sought that preserve the original assumption. Blame placed on individual officers, on tactical error, on bad luck. What is not accepted is the idea that the opposing army understood modern war well enough to defeat it deliberately. The loss is framed as an exception, even as its scale refuses to shrink. Further north, less than 2 decades later, Italy enters the Horn of Africa with ambitions sharpened by nationalism and the desire to join Europe's imperial powers as an equal. Ethiopian resistance is underestimated from the outset, treated as a temporary obstacle to be managed through treaties signed under duress and misunderstood terms. But Ethiopia is not improvising. Under Emperor Menelik II, it has spent years acquiring modern rifles and artillery from multiple European suppliers, stockpiling ammunition, and building an army capable of sustained operations. When negotiations collapse, both sides mobilize for war. At Adwa in 1896, Italian forces advance divided and poorly coordinated, their commanders relying on flawed maps and rigid assumptions about Ethiopian capabilities. Ethiopian forces arrive in overwhelming numbers, but not without structure. Units maneuver across broken terrain with coordination that surprises their opponents. Artillery is deployed effectively. Supply lines hold. When the fighting ends, the Italian army is shattered. Thousands are killed or captured. Equipment is seized. Italy's colonial ambition collapses in a single day, and Ethiopia remains independent while nearly the rest of the continent is carved apart. This defeat cannot be dismissed quietly. It is investigated publicly, debated in Parliament, and reported across Europe with a mixture of astonishment and embarrassment. For the first time, an African state has not only defeated a European power, but forced it to recognize that defeat diplomatically. Treaties are rewritten. Governments fall. The myth of effortless expansion fractures under the weight of undeniable fact. These are not isolated moments. Across the continent, European forces encounter resistance that refuses to conform to expectation. Campaigns drag on longer than planned. Casualties mount. Supplies fail. Commanders find themselves fighting opponents who adapt under fire, shifting tactics, exploiting terrain, and absorbing losses without collapse. Each engagement chips away at the belief that industrial power alone determines victory. What unites these defeats is not chance, but miscalculation. European commanders consistently underestimate African capacity for coordination, endurance, and strategic planning. They mistake unfamiliar methods for absence of method, different doctrine for lack of discipline. When confronted with evidence to the contrary, the response is rarely introspection. Instead, explanations are narrowed until they preserve the original worldview intact. Yet the battlefield does not negotiate with belief. Losses are counted, retreats are ordered, equipment is abandoned. Messages are sent home that cannot fully conceal what has occurred. In these moments, Europe does not merely lose battles, it loses certainty. The conviction that colonization is a matter of schedule rather than struggle is exposed as fiction. By the end of these confrontations, The reality is unavoidable. African armies have not stumbled into victory. They have earned it through preparation, coordination, and a clear understanding of their enemy. And for Europe, the consequences will extend far beyond the immediate losses, forcing changes in policy, strategy, and narrative that will reshape the course of empire itself. The aftermath does not unfold on the battlefield. It spreads outward, quietly at first, then with gathering force, crossing oceans and entering chambers where victories were expected and explanations demanded. Telegrams arrive in European capitals carrying numbers that refuse to align with projections, casualties too high, timelines shattered, objectives unmet. Maps are unfolded again, this time with a different urgency, as ministers and generals confront the reality that expansion has limits they did not anticipate. In government offices, the immediate question is not moral, but practical. How did this happen? Committees are formed, inquiries convened, reports drafted with language carefully chosen to soften the blow. Individual commanders are scrutinized, sometimes sacrificed, as institutions attempt to contain the damage. Tactical errors are highlighted. Terrain is blamed. Weather is cited. Anything that prevents the conclusion from becoming systemic is given room to breathe. But consequences cannot be contained by phrasing alone. In Europe's press, the defeats spark fascination and unease in equal measure. Headlines describe fallen regiments and captured flags. Political cartoons, sharpened with irony, depict imperial arrogance punctured by unexpected resistance. Public confidence wavers, not because empire is questioned outright, but because its supposed inevitability has been disrupted. The idea that colonization is a smooth extension of industrial progress no longer feels secure. Policy shifts follow. Where speed once defined expansion, caution now intrudes. Military planners revise assumptions, emphasizing concentration of force, heavier artillery, and longer supply lines. Intelligence gathering becomes more systematic. Campaigns are delayed, reinforced, and redesigned. Diplomacy is recalibrated, not out of respect, but necessity. Treaties are renegotiated with greater care, and in some cases, expansion pauses altogether as governments reassess the cost of pushing forward. The global impact extends beyond Europe. Other imperial powers observe closely, absorbing lessons without acknowledging their source. The message is clear even when unspoken. African resistance can be effective, and defeat carries consequences at home. The balance of prestige shifts subtly. An empire embarrassed abroad risks instability at home, and leaders become acutely aware that distant wars now echo in domestic politics. For African states, the immediate effects are complex. Victory brings breathing room, not permanence. Some territories gain time, years or decades during which independence holds, institutions strengthen, and diplomacy continues. Others face renewed pressure from better prepared adversaries determined not to repeat earlier mistakes. The space created by victory is fragile, but it is real, and it alters the tempo of conquest across the continent. International observers take note. Newspapers outside Europe report the defeats with curiosity rather than alarm. In some corners of the world, the events are read as signs that European dominance is not absolute, that industrial power does not guarantee universal control. These interpretations remain marginal, but they exist, quietly undermining the moral authority empire claims for itself. What is most striking is how quickly adaptation replaces reflection. European powers do not abandon colonization, they refine it. The lessons drawn focus on how to win next time, not on why the assumption of effortless victory was flawed to begin with. Military budgets increase. New doctrines are drafted. The machinery of empire adjusts, absorbing defeat as data rather than indictment. Yet the psychological shift lingers. Confidence never fully returns to its earlier innocence. Each new campaign carries the memory, sometimes unspoken, of what happens when certainty outruns understanding. The defeats have forced Europe to recognize Africa not as a passive frontier, but as a field of actors capable of shaping outcomes. That recognition, however uncomfortable, cannot be fully erased. By the turn of the century, colonization resumes with renewed force, but the myth of inevitability has been permanently cracked. Beneath the rhetoric of progress and order lies an unacknowledged truth. Europe has learned through loss that power must be asserted carefully, because it can be resisted effectively. And that lesson, though rarely admitted, will shape imperial behavior long after the headlines fade. When the empires wrote their histories, these wars did not disappear all at once. They faded. Victories were celebrated, defeats compressed, reclassified, or pushed to the margins where they could no longer disrupt the larger story being told. In textbooks and official histories, Africa returned to its familiar role, not as a place where European power was challenged and sometimes broken, but as a backdrop to imperial expansion presented as ultimately successful and morally justified. The language shifted subtly. Battles that had once shaken governments were reframed as setbacks. Wars lost outright were reduced to footnotes, stripped of their political and strategic weight. African victories were described as anomalies caused by terrain, numbers, or temporary advantage, never as evidence of equal or superior planning. The implication was clear. These outcomes did not change the story, so they did not deserve space within it. This process was not accidental. Empire required coherence, and coherence required inevitability. A narrative that acknowledged repeated documented defeats at the hands of African states would fracture the moral logic of colonization itself. If Europeans could lose, fairly, decisively, and publicly, then the claim of inherent superiority collapsed. It was easier and safer to let silence do the work that denial could not. Archives still held the truth. Parliamentary inquiries, military reports, casualty lists, and diplomatic correspondence remained preserved in government buildings and museums. The evidence was never destroyed. It was simply isolated, accessible to specialists, but absent from popular memory. Over time, generations learned a simplified version of the past, one in which resistance existed only to be overcome, and African agency appeared only as background noise. Even within Europe, remembrance followed selective lines. Defeated officers were remembered for their service, not their losses. Campaigns were commemorated without acknowledging how they began or why they failed. The focus remained forward-facing, on eventual conquest, administration, and control, rather than on the moments when expansion stalled or reversed. Memory became an extension of policy. For African societies, the memory endured differently. Victories were carried through oral history, ritual, and local tradition, often disconnected from the global narrative that ignored them. These stories survived not as triumphalist myth, but as proof of capability and warning, a reminder that resistance had once worked and that preparation mattered. Yet without reinforcement from international history, these memories were often dismissed as legend rather than corroborated fact. The result is a historical imbalance that persists today. Many people encounter the idea of European defeat in Africa as a surprise, even though the documentation has always existed. The shock does not come from the events themselves, but from realizing how thoroughly they were excluded from the version of history most widely taught. Silence, repeated long enough, becomes truth by default. What remains when the noise of empire fades is a quieter and more unsettling picture. European power was formidable, but not invincible. African states were not passive, nor were their victories accidental. They studied, adapted, organized, and fought with purpose, forcing some of the most powerful nations on Earth to retreat, regroup, and reconsider. These wars do not overturn history, they complete it. They reveal a world more complex than the story empire preferred to tell, a world where ingenuity mattered more than assumption, and where the outcome of war was never guaranteed simply by who claimed to be modern. They were not forgotten because they were insignificant. They were forgotten because they proved something uncomfortable, that dominance had limits, and that those limits were exposed more than once on African ground.